The person who ghosted you? Science says they were in pain, not you. Them. And when I tell you exactly why, you're going to see that whole experience completely differently. We've heard the surface stuff. They lost interest. They were seeing someone else. They just didn't care. And maybe some of that is true. But none of it actually explains the deeper question. Why does a person choose to disappear rather than just say something? Anything. Carl Jung had a name for exactly why some people go silent instead of honest. And by the time I tell you what it is, you'll understand the person who ghosted you better than they probably understand themselves. Let's get into it. Before we get into the mind of the ghoster, let's talk about what happens to you first. Because people really don't understand it. In 2003, a neuroscientist at UCLA named Naomi Eisenberger ran a study where she put people in an fMRI scanner and had them play a simple online game with two other players. At some point, the other players just stopped passing to them. No warning. They were just cut out. The part of the brain that activated? The anterior cingulate cortex. The same region that fires when you feel physical pain. Not emotional distress in some vague sense. The same exact circuitry as when you break a bone. So when you say, being ghosted hurt, you're not being dramatic. That's literally what's happening in your brain. Here's what makes ghosting worse than a regular rejection, though. A clean, I'm not interested, gives your brain something to process. It files it, moves on. Ghosting doesn't. There's no explanation. So your brain stays in a loop, running the same questions, looking for a cause it never gets. The wound stays open because there's nothing to close it with. But here's the thing. The more revealing psychology isn't yours. It's theirs. And what the research says about ghosters, not what you'd expect. Because the people who ghost, they weren't emotionally detached. They weren't cold. The two feelings researchers found most? Guilt and relief at the same time. And that combination tells us everything. A 2022 study in the Journal of Social Psychology tracked the emotional experience of both the person who ghosted and the person who was ghosted. And the results were striking. The ghosters reported two dominant feelings, guilt and relief, simultaneously. That's a very specific emotional profile. Guilt and relief together is what you feel when you've avoided something you knew you should have faced. It's not the profile of someone who didn't care. It's the profile of someone who cared enough to feel guilty and was scared enough to run anyway. So the real question becomes, what exactly were they running from? To answer that, we need to go back further. Back to childhood, actually. Because this behavior doesn't start with you. It started long before you ever came into the picture. Researchers at the University of Kansas studied how people end relationships and found that people with what's called an avoidant attachment style are significantly more likely to ghost than anyone else. Avoidant attachment isn't a personality flaw. It's a learned pattern, usually from childhood. Maybe a parent was inconsistent. Warm one day, withdrawn the next. Maybe vulnerability was met with criticism or dismissal. Over time, the brain learns one rule. Getting close to people means getting hurt. So keep a safe distance. As adults, these people can be warm, interesting, even seem emotionally open, up to a point. But when a relationship starts to deepen, when the other person starts to matter too much, something in them pulls the emergency brake. And the easiest way to pull that brake without explaining it, without sitting across from someone and saying, I'm scared of how much I feel for you, is to just disappear. About 20% of adults carry this style. 1 in 5 people. So if you've been ghosted more than once, there's a reasonable chance you've run into this pattern. Not because of anything you did, but because of something they've been carrying around since long before they met you. But attachment theory only gets us so far. To understand why some people are fundamentally incapable of having that honest conversation, we need to go somewhere deeper. Carl Jung spent decades studying exactly this, the part of a person that makes honesty feel impossible, and what he found is the real explanation behind ghosting. Here it is. Jung had this idea that every person carries what he called a shadow. Not evil, not darkness in some dramatic sense. Something more specific. The shadow is every part of yourself you've decided is unacceptable. The weakness, the fear, the confusion, the parts that feel too messy to show anyone. Those parts don't disappear. They get pushed underground, into the unconscious. And on top of that, you build what Jung called the persona, the mask, the version of you that the world sees. Competent, fine, unbothered, moved on. Now apply that to someone who is about to ghost you. They're sitting with a feeling they don't know how to handle. Maybe they're falling for you, and it terrifies them. Maybe they feel guilty about something. Maybe they genuinely don't know what they want, and admitting that feels humiliating. All of that is shadow material, the stuff they've spent years learning not to show. Having the real conversation would mean letting some of that surface. And their entire psychological system is built to prevent exactly that. So they go quiet. They keep the mask on. And you're left staring at your phone, wondering what you did wrong, while they tell themselves they just weren't feeling it. A story clean enough to live with. Jung wrote about this directly. He said, paraphrasing, "When an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside as fate. The things you refuse to look at in yourself don't disappear. They keep showing up in your life, in different forms, until you finally deal with them. For a ghoster, that looks like a pattern. New person, same pull toward closeness, same panic, same disappearance. The faces change, the story doesn't. And here's the part nobody talks about. Because most people assume the ghoster walks away feeling fine. The research says something very different. People with avoidant attachment don't walk away feeling free. Research on dismissive avoidance shows they often think about the person they ghosted, sometimes years later, especially when they struggle to form real connections with whoever comes next. Think about this. The ghoster who couldn't look you in the eye, they might still be scrolling your Instagram 3 years from now, not because they're a stalker, because you were unresolved. You were the thing they ran from before they understood themselves enough not to run. There's even a term for it, the phantom ex, the person who mattered enough to flee, who then becomes the quiet benchmark nobody else quite reaches. As Professor R.J. Starr's research points out, ghosting rarely eliminates the discomfort the ghoster was trying to avoid. It just transfers it. They carry the guilt. They repeat the cycle, and the very depth of connection they were running from becomes the thing they can't quite find anywhere else. Disappearing doesn't free them. It just postpones the same reckoning with themselves. Most conversations about ghosting go one of two ways. Either, ghosters are cowards, you're better off without them, which feels satisfying for about 5 minutes. Or, maybe you did something wrong, here's how to be better, which isn't fair to you and misses the point entirely. Here's what I almost never see anyone say. Ghosting is information, not about your worth, about their capacity. When someone disappears without explanation, they're showing you, very clearly, that in this moment, they don't have the emotional tools to show up honestly. That's not a moral verdict. It's just an observation. Some people genuinely aren't there yet, and you cannot build something real with a person who is still running from their own shadow. That doesn't make it hurt less, but it does change what it means. The disappearance was never really about you. It was about the conversation they couldn't have with themselves. Here's what I want you to sit with before you close this video. Have you ever done something close to ghosting? Not necessarily full disappearance, but fading. Leaving someone on read a little longer than you should have. Giving a one-word reply until they stop trying. Going quiet instead of saying the honest thing. Most of us have. At some point. For the same reasons. Drop it in the comments. No judgment here. I'm genuinely curious. What made it feel impossible to just say the thing? And if this video gave you something real, the next one goes even deeper. I'll see you there.